Hi students, in this video we're going to talk about an excerpt from Billy Budd's Sailor by Herman Melville. That's your reading for today. And before we get into that, we're going to do a little review. Some of this will be familiar right from the past, but it's important and I want you to remember it for the final exam and things like that. So we're going to do some review. If you feel like, I really get it, John, I don't need to do any more review, then, so be it. Skip ahead. But if you want to try and practice the review material a little more, then let's get to it. All right, so first question, right? What is punishment? Pause the video if you need to, try and figure out what's the answer to this question. And you might remember there are 4 parts to the answer. Punishment is the intentional infliction, right? Intentional infliction of harm. It's hard treatment. We're negatively impacting someone's well-being. So intentional infliction of harm by an authority, someone in charge, someone who's the law's given the power to enforce the rules. And that gets to the last part, right? For a rule violation. So someone has to have done something wrong, violated a rule, and in that case, what you're doing is punishing. What are our reasons for punishing? Now remember, there are some utilitarian reasons, retributivist reasons, right? There are some other sorts of reasons that we're not focusing on, but that also go in here. Think about what those are, maybe try and list them out, figure out which ones are utilitarian, which ones aren't. The reasons why we punish people, and I'll list them in the order that I've given them in the past. First, denunciation. You're just saying, hey, that's bad, don't do it. Deterrence. You're trying to discourage people from doing the act. General deterrence, right? Discouraging the general public from doing the act. Special deterrence, deterring the particular criminal from committing that act again in the future. Incapacitation. We're discouraging, preventing someone from causing harm by putting them in prison, something like that. Again, deterrence and incapacitation are sort of the main utilitarian justifications for punishment, though denunciation is like a semi-utilitarian reason, and rehabilitation is another sort of semi-utilitarian reason, trying to make the person better, fix their character, that sort of thing. Restoration, we might try and, fix, resolve, restore the situation to what it was before. That might be a reason to punish. And then finally, retribution, right? That's the retributivist justification. We're giving the criminal what they deserve. There are 3 views, 3 theories of when we're justified in punishing someone. The utilitarian theory says punishment's justified if and only if it's useful. So if we break that down, what are the tenets of the utilitarian view? 1, if punishment's useful, then it's justified. 2, if it's justified, punishment's justified, then it's useful. 3, the amount of punishment should be tailored to maximize happiness. That's the utilitarian view. What about the retributivist view, right? Think about, how would I write that out? Again, here's an opportunity to practice. Unpause it, right, when you've got the view, when you've got the tenets down. So the view says punishment is justified if and only if it's deserved. So if we go to break that down into its 3 tenets, we get if punishment's deserved, then it's justified. If punishment is justified, then it's deserved. And finally, that the amount of punishment that we give someone should be tailored to what they deserve. Finally, the last view is the mixed theory of punishment. And that theory says punishment's justified if and only if it's useful and deserved. So both of those things. If punishment is useful and deserved, then it's justified. If punishment's justified, then it's got to be useful and deserved. It's to have both of those things. And then as for when we should punish, how much we should punish, the amount of punishment should be tailored directed at achieving the best balance between usefulness and deservedness. I've given some other ways that we might do that. It's as useful as possible without being too severe, or it's as deserved as possible without being useless, something like that. Okay, that's the review. So in this excerpt from Billy Budd Sailor, we read about sort of the trial that Billy Budd is put on. So I'm going to set up the details there. But before I do that, I want to just sort of give a quick overview of what we're trying to accomplish in this unit of the course, or this week. And I think the answer to that question is that we want to sort of look into this, like the retributivist style view, where what we're doing is we're punishing people who deserve it. And then we're looking to see if how our intuitions about desert match up with the law as it's currently functioning. So when we look at the criminal law, we see that one of the requirements in order to be guilty of most crimes is that you have to have what's called mens rea, which is a guilty mind. And the thought there is that if you do something accidentally and cause harm, then that's not a crime. But if you sort of knowingly do something that's against the law, then that is a crime. And so establishing that someone has this sort of these evil or bad intentions, or at least the intention to break the law, is going to be crucial to showing that they're guilty of some sort of criminal activity. So in this Billy Budd case, we sort of see this question raised, and we're going to get a bit of a tension here between, do we really need that guilty mind in order to find someone guilty of some crime, or do we not? So let's take a look at the case. So the facts, where we pick up sort of the reading, Billy Budd, this sailor, he's really loved by everyone. People like him. And he's falsely accused of conspiracy to mutiny by Claggart, who is the ship's master-at-arms. I don't know exactly what a master-at-arms does on a ship, but the idea is he's a pretty important guy. He's definitely more important than Billy Budd. And why exactly Claggart is accusing Billy Budd of conspiracy to mutiny is a bit unclear. I know that I read this back when I was in high school, but it's been too long. So what we need to know is, that doesn't really matter. All that matters is Claggart's kind of the bad guy, and he's falsely accusing Billy Budd of this crime. Okay, so Billy Budd has difficulty speaking, especially when he's angry or excited. So he has a hard time expressing himself. And so he can't verbally defend himself against the sort of accusation that Claggart's making. So he's just sort of getting angrier and angrier, right? And he can't say anything in his defense. So instead of saying something or speaking up, right, he expresses the frustration that he's feeling by punching Claggart. Now, ordinarily, right, the punch would be, it's not good to punch a superior officer, but certainly not the kind of punch that would kill someone. But that's what happens. So Billy doesn't intend to kill Claggart, but he ends up sort of falling and hitting his head, and the next thing you know, Claggart dies. So that's the situation that we're sort of faced with. I think one thing that's really interesting here, especially given the sort of issues our society is dealing with right now, is this idea that there might be cases in which people are being oppressed or harmed when they don't feel like their voice or what they're saying is really being heard, and so there might be an inclination to respond with violence. And I think that we're really seeing that, as I'm recording this, sort of the summer of 2020, we're seeing protests in Portland that are becoming ever more controversial and sort of this hot button political issue. Are the protesters going beyond the norms of protest? The federal guards being called in, they're threatening the protesters. this really not a good situation, but I think really it has some similarities to here, right? People aren't responding to the needs and desires of the protesters, and so you get the protesters feeling like, well, we can't speak, we can't defend ourselves in this one way, so we're gonna resort to violence. And whether maybe if you're inclined to think, well, that's not an okay reaction, you should never be violent, maybe we can look to Billy Budd as sort of someone who helps us appreciate why, oh yeah, I get it. I can see why Billy Budd punched this person. And if we can see why Billy Budd punched this person, then maybe we can see why people would resort to violence in similar kinds of situations. Okay, anyway, so that's a bit off topic, but I think it just goes to show that this example from the story that Herman Melville wrote a long time ago, right, is really still relevant to the issues that we're facing today. Okay. So what happens, right, now that Billy Budd's done this? What are we going to do with him? So the Mutiny Act, which Captain Veer, he's sort of the ship's captain, and he's the one sort of speaking to this drum court about what we should do. Captain Veer points out, like, according to the Mutiny Act, right, striking a superior officer is a capital offense, right? He recognizes, however, that there are these sorts of mitigating circumstances, right? So Billy had been falsely accused. No one sort of really thinks that Billy was planning a mutiny. And Billy, they recognize, has difficulty speaking when he's angry or excited. So, people think ordinarily Billy's not the kind of person to be violent, but he couldn't say anything in his defense and he was being falsely accused. So we can sort of understand where he's coming from. So the question that the sort of drum court is faced with is this question of whether or not Billy Budd is guilty of violating the Mutiny Act. Is he guilty of this sort of violating these naval set of rules? That's a question that I want you to think a little bit about, right? So, striking a superior officer. In a sense, he clearly did it, but did he really intend to do it? And does that matter, right? Should we, I guess, to what extent does the sort of criminal mind play an important role here? So figure out what you think about this question. Is Billy Budd guilty? Once you've figured out your answer, why you think that's the right answer, can articulate your view, then go ahead and move on. So how does the court rule? In the end, they find Billy Budd guilty, and they sentence him to hang the following morning. So, maybe something you're like, I didn't anticipate that, but this crime, right? If Billy Budd is guilty of it, then death, right? He's got to die. That's the penalty, and so finding him guilty is kind of a high stakes situation. Now, this is a hypothetical, right? It's a hypothetical, theoretical type of case. It didn't, this didn't really actually happen. Billy Budd isn't a real story. Did something like it ever happen? Yeah, probably things similar to this have happened in the past. But really, the thing that's interesting here that we really want to ask about or think about is the sort of philosophical issue. And the philosophical issue is this punishment justified? So, say we were in that situation and had to decide Billy Budd's fate. How should we decide? Would we be justified in punishing him in this way? Would we not be? I think there are sort of two questions. There's a question of, sort of generally speaking, we can imagine that Billy Budd isn't like subject to these rules of like the naval, rules of wartime or the naval sort of laws. We could just imagine that Billy Budd is just a normal guy who punched someone on the street who was making him angry and ends up killing him, and think about how we should punish him there. Or we can think about it in this sort of naval way. I think, both questions sort of have their own interesting features. But what I want to do is talk through kind of some of the arguments or the way you can argue for different conclusions here. So before we look at those, though, I would encourage you, right, just to think for yourself, right? Is this punishment justified? Yes or no? Why or why not? How would you argue for your conclusion? And here you might want to think about utilitarian arguments versus retributivist arguments. Why do you hold the view you do? Is it because you have sort of utilitarian sympathies or because you have more retributivist sympathies? Think about that. Okay, so what I want to start with is looking at Captain Vere's argument. So how is he trying to convince the court to punish Billy Budd? Here's what he says. He says, so executing Billy is going to prevent a mutiny. So his idea is like, if we don't find Billy guilty, we're going to look weak, and then the sailors are going to think they can sort of do whatever they want when they want to, and that's bad. We need to like establish control, and executing Billy is going to establish control. It's going to prevent potential mutiny. Premise 2 says that like if that premise is true, if this action is going to prevent a mutiny, then it's going to maximize utility. It's going to produce the most net happiness. So we have this intermediate conclusion. So executing Billy is going to maximize utility. It's going to produce the most net happiness. Premise 3 says if a punishment will maximize utility, then it's justified. And the conclusion is that therefore executing Billy is justified. So executing Billy is going to maximize utility. If a punishment maximizes utility, then it's justified. So executing Billy is justified. Now, as I said before, this is a kind of utilitarian argument. It's a utilitarian argument because of premise 3, right? Premise 3 is just utilitarianism about punishment. If a punishment maximizes utility, if it's useful, then it's justified. And so executing Billy is justified. The thought here, right, is basically like, yeah, this sucks for Billy, and it may be unfair, but it's going to produce the best consequences, and so we should do it. That's how Vere's argument goes. Now, there's a utilitarian argument we could give in Billy Budd's defense, I think, as well. And this just sort of maybe emphasizes slightly different empirical facts. So utilitarianism, at the end of the day, is really is going to rest on sort of the empirical details. Does this thing maximize utility? Does it not? You might think executing Billy will do no good, right? It harms an innocent person, and maybe you think there wouldn't be a mutiny one way or the other. It's really not going to make a difference. So if you think we really need to execute Billy in order to prevent a mutiny, then that previous argument is going to be the one you think is right. If you think executing Billy really doesn't make much of a difference at all, then this argument might be the one you want to go with. So premise 2 says if premise 1 is true, if executing Billy will do no good, then it won't maximize utility, won't maximize net happiness. So executing Billy won't maximize utility. If a punishment won't maximize utility, then it's not justified. If it's not going to produce good consequences, if it's not useful, then it's not justified. Conclusion, executing Billy isn't justified. Again, premise 3 is a utilitarian claim. It's just utilitarianism about punishment set into the argument. If the sort of empirical facts are as they are described here, if executing Billy will do no good, then utilitarianism entails that we cannot execute Billy. And this is a hard question, right? So one thing to note is that it's hard before the fact to know whether or not a particular punishment is going to have good consequences or bad. Sometimes they have good consequences, sometimes it wouldn't have made a difference one way or the other. This ends up leading a lot of utilitarians about punishment to think about not really looking not to like the actual utility or actually what happens, but rather sort of like what we should expect to happen. So thinking about something like, well, what do we expect to happen if we execute Billy? What do we expect to happen if we don't execute Billy? You know, what's the probability that this is going to prevent a mutiny? If it's really high probability that it's going to prevent a mutiny, then maybe it's justified. According to utilitarianism, it's a really low probability that it's going to have any effect. It's probably nobody's probably going to revolt. Then utilitarianism is going to say that it's not justified. So anyway, I think that's just a way to show that depending on, you can be utilitarian about punishment and think either that we should execute Billy or that we shouldn't. Now let's look at retributivism. So retributivism, I think, can also give arguments for and against Billy Budd's being punished. So here, I'm going to give a retributivist argument in Billy Budd's defense. I think maybe this is the most natural way to think about it from a retributivist point of view. So premise 1, Billy didn't intend to kill Claggart. And premise 2 says if Billy didn't intend to kill Claggart, then he doesn't deserve to be executed. So the thought here is you only really deserve punishment if you intend to do something poorly, to do something wrong. And so since Billy didn't intend, he doesn't deserve to be executed. Conclusion 1, Billy doesn't deserve to be executed. And if a punishment isn't deserved, so if execution isn't deserved, then it isn't justified. So conclusion 2, executing Billy isn't justified. Now again, when we look at this argument, we've got one of the premises that is a moral premise. It's stating sort of a theory about punishment. If you've been paying attention, you notice in the other arguments it was premise 3, and that's true again here. Premise 3, if a punishment isn't deserved, then it isn't justified. That's just retributivism about punishment. So it's also worth noting, that's the mixed theory about punishment would say that too. So and the mixed theory would sort of be committed to the same kinds of premises that were given in the utilitarian argument. If a punishment isn't useful and isn't justified, the mixed theorist would agree with that. So the mixed theorist is going to have a high bar for punishment. It's got to sort of meet both the utilitarian and the retributivist conditions in order to be justified. Okay, so whether or not you accept premise 3 is going to depend a bit on whether or not you accept retributivism. Finally, I want to give a retributivist argument against Billy Budd, because I think there is a way to think, well, I'm a retributivist, but I still think that Billy Budd should be punished. And so how would that argument go? This argument's a little bit more complicated. Premise 1 starts, Billy Budd struck a superior officer. Premise 2, if someone strikes a superior officer, Billy strikes a superior officer, then Billy violated the Mutiny Act. Because the Mutiny Act says you can't strike a superior officer. Now, I'm going to skip the intermediate conclusions here because there are a number of them. So I'm just going to, I think from premise 1 and premise 2, we get something like Billy violated the Mutiny Act. Premise 3, if someone violates the Mutiny Act, then they deserve the associated punishment. So Billy deserves the associated punishment. Premise 4, the punishment associated with striking a superior officer is execution. Okay, so Billy deserves execution, it looks like. That's an intermediate conclusion. Then we get premise 5, if a punishment is deserved, then it's justified. Conclusion, executing Billy is justified. And here, again, I said more complex argument, more steps along the way, but all these steps look pretty good. Again, the controversial premise when it comes to when we look at the theories of punishment is this fifth premise. That's again a statement of retributivism about punishment. If punishment's deserved, then it's justified. So if you're a retributivist, you might think that executing Billy is justified because you're not paying so much attention to intentions. Maybe you think those don't really matter. What matters is that Billy, knowingly, willingly punched a superior officer. And that even though execution is ordinarily too steep of a penalty for that, it's not in this wartime scenario. Okay, so what we want to do here is just sort of zoom out, right, in closing, and ask ourselves this question again, right? Earlier we had a judgment about whether or not Billy Budd's punishment is justified. You've looked at a variety of different arguments, one way or the other, about what we should think about Billy Budd's punishment. and now you can sort of reflect on that question, come up with an answer, and we'll talk about that in class. All right, that's it for this video, and we'll see you later.